The bells of St. Fridswide's were in no hurry that morning. They stumbled into the damp air with a heaviness I'd never much liked, the sound blurring against the wet stone of the college walls. The peal was meant to be joyous, I suppose, but someone, some poor undergraduate most likely, had misjudged the rhythm, letting the final chime lag behind like an old man refusing to cross a road. From my chair in the Randolph's lounge, I tried to return to the crossword, but the sound nagged at the corner of my thoughts. I had been circling a clue for the better part of 20 minutes. 7 letters, an ecclesiastical seat. Too obvious to be cathedra, too neat to be the answer I wanted. The coffee on the low table beside me had cooled to the point where even my curiosity could not coax another sip. The lounge smelt faintly of damp coats and burnt toast, the sort of smell that clings to the edges of a Sunday morning in this city. Lewis found me there, shaking the rain from his jacket in that brisk, unceremonious way he has. He did not sit immediately. There's a certain hesitation in him when he brings bad news, as if the words might dissolve in the air before they reach me. Father Adrian Mallory, he said, had died suddenly the night before, only hours after leading evensong in the chapel. The official account was efficient and bloodless. A heart attack, natural causes, nothing to disturb the quiet dignity of a college Sunday. I remember staring at the crossword again, the pencil idle in my hand. The answer I had been avoiding came to me in a rush. C! As if the mind, when confronted with death, reaches instinctively for the simplest, most absolute word it can find. I asked him whether anyone had been there when it happened. Lewis shook his head. Mallory had walked back alone from the chapel, had been found later in his rooms by the porter. No sign of distress before, no warning, no witnesses. There was a pause in our conversation, filled only by the low murmur of 2 American tourists by the window, discussing which colleges were worth the price of admission. I thought of Mallory as I had last seen him. Slender, stooped, with a voice that could move between warmth and reproof without ever altering its tone. A man who had the manner of one keeping a private appointment in his mind even as he spoke to you. I said, perhaps too lightly, that sermons can kill more than boredom. Lewis gave me the look he reserves for remarks he doesn't wish to encourage, but cannot quite refute. The rain, I noticed, had begun to ease, leaving the streets outside slick and unevenly lit. The bells had fallen silent. There was, in their absence, an odd stillness, as if the city had paused to listen for something that had not yet happened. I felt a prickle of unease, not grief, exactly, but the faint recognition that the pattern of things had been disturbed. It was then I recalled something from evensong the previous evening. I had not attended, but I had passed by the chapel as the service was ending. Through the open doors I had heard the choir conclude, the organs swell and recede, and then, quite distinctly, a single note sustained beyond its place, held until it became an intrusion. I had dismissed it as the hesitation of a nervous organist. Yet now, with Mallory gone, the memory returned with the sharpness of a miswritten letter in a line of neat script. Lewis was speaking again about the college's arrangements, the inquest that would no doubt confirm the obvious. I listened, or seemed to, but my mind was elsewhere. On that note, on the misjudged bells, on the slight disorder that had crept into the morning. Outside, the first shafts of sunlight broke across the wet paving stones, and I thought, not for the first time, that Oxford is never more itself than in the moment after rain, when everything seems washed clean but nothing has truly changed. Mallory's study smelt faintly of beeswax and the dry perfume of old paper. The windows looked across the quad, but the curtains had been drawn to half-light, as if the room had already begun its long retreat into dust. There was a stillness that made one lower one's voice without thinking. Lewis went to the desk, I to the mantelpiece, both of us moving as though in a place where memory was stored in layers, and one wrong breath might scatter it. The desk was unnervingly neat, the blotter aligned with the edge, the pens in their stand upright and evenly spaced, a ruler flush against the inkwell. It was the kind of arrangement that speaks not of tidiness but of a private order, one that survives only so long as the owner is alive to maintain it. Except, there it was, one page lying at an angle across the blotter, its top corner pressing into the pile of completed pages. The handwriting was Mallory's, firm, but with a tendency to let the descenders lengthen, as though words wanted to sink further into the page. The last sentence trailed off mid-word, the final loop unfinished, the ink slightly heavier where the nib had paused. Lewis, leaning over my shoulder, observed that the sermon had been unusually short. He had heard it read aloud, he said, and it ended with a quotation from George Herbert. Well, almost Herbert. One word had been altered, just enough to change the temperature of the line. I read it myself. The original, if I remembered correctly, was, "Who sweeps a room? As for thy laws, makes that and the action fine." Mallory had written, "Thy cause." I folded the sheet into my pocket without asking permission. On the mantelpiece, a photograph in a silver frame showed Mallory flanked by 3 younger men, the background suggesting the college gardens in summer. 20 years must have passed since it was taken, but the expressions were the kind that resist the erosion of time, the faintly amused self-possession of those who believe the future will be theirs for the taking. They were named on the back in Mallory's hand, though the ink had faded to the colour of dried heather. Each, I knew, had gone on to prominent positions, though in markedly different fields. The bursar came in while I was still holding the photograph. He was a small, compact man whose jacket seemed too thick for the room, his smile perfectly practised. He insisted that Mallory had been beloved by students, by colleagues, by the college as an institution. He said it in the way one might insist that the portrait over the fireplace was an accurate likeness, though no one living had seen the original subject. I asked for the guest register from the previous week. The bursar blinked as if I had requested the chapel silver. There was nothing unusual in the comings and goings, he assured me. Still, he would see what could be arranged. I did not press him. People give more when they believe you are prepared to wait. Lewis had begun opening drawers with a care that suggested he did not want to be accused of prying. But Mallory, it seemed, had been a man who did not leave things unfinished, except for that one page. The sermons, bound in neat volumes, filled a shelf to the left of the desk. All were dated and indexed. I took down the one from the previous month and compared the tone, measured, slightly formal, each ending with a scriptural or poetic cadence that left no ambiguity. The altered Herbert line was an anomaly, and I have long since learned that anomalies are where the ground begins to shift. As we left, I glanced again at the photograph. The faces seemed to have grown more distant, as though the glass had thickened between us. Outside, the quad lay in shadow, the damp flagstones still holding the memory of last night's rain. Somewhere in the chapel, the organist was practicing, a line of music repeated and then abandoned halfway through, like a thought that refused to be finished. The choir room smelled of damp wool and brass polish, the mingled scents of coats drying on hooks and instruments that had been handled for decades. Light came in pale through the leaded windows, settling uneasily on the scuffed floorboards. The choristers, scattered about in no particular order, regarded Lewis and me with that mixture of curiosity and caution which is bred into people who sing for a living. They know that any misjudged note can be remembered far longer than the ones they got right. It was Charlotte Ayres who drew my attention first. A music lecturer at the college, she carried herself as if the air were tuned differently around her. Her voice, low, unhurried, was not the kind one forgets, and I found myself listening to its shape as much as its content. She spoke of Mallory with careful precision, noting that in recent weeks he had been not himself. There had been moments during rehearsals when he seemed to lose the thread entirely, looking past the singers as though something just out of sight had caught him. He had even cancelled a planned lecture on truth in the Gospels, and a mission she found particularly strange. Mallory, she said, was not a man to leave intellectual debts unpaid. Lewis asked about the night of evensong. Most recalled nothing unusual, but one tenor, awkward in the way of a man unused to the attention of strangers, mentioned seeing Mallory in the cloister earlier that week, speaking in what he delicately described as brisk tones to Dr. Edward Venn. Brisk, as it turned out, was polite shorthand for heated. Venn was a historian, well regarded for his work on Tudor politics, and less well regarded for his fondness for claret. A man, the tenor added, whose sharp tongue had been known to draw blood. I glanced at Charlotte when Venn's name came up. She adjusted the cuff of her sleeve with exaggerated care, her gaze drifting to the high window as though measuring the light. It was a small thing, but small things have a way of lodging in my mind. She did not meet my eyes again until the subject had moved on. The choir filed out gradually, voices dropping to private tones as they stepped into the corridor. Charlotte remained behind to collect some scores from the piano. I thanked her for her time, and she smiled, too briefly to leave an impression of ease. There was something withheld in it, a note not sung but felt in the silence that followed. Lewis was already at the door when I asked almost idly whether she had attended Mallory's last sermon. She had, she said, and then hesitated, as if wondering whether the truth was worth the telling. Mallory had seemed burdened. That was her word, as though speaking into the chapel was an act that cost him more than it once had. In the quadrangle, the air was sharper, the damp stones throwing back a faint echo of our steps. I told Lewis about Charlotte's glance away at Ven's name, though I did not pretend to know what it meant. He suggested she might simply dislike the man. Possibly. But dislike does not always avert the eyes. Sometimes it sharpens them. Avoidance, I've found, belongs more often to guilt or to memory. Across the lawn the chapel door stood ajar, a sliver of shadow against the pale afternoon. Somewhere within a single voice was running scales, each note rising clean, then faltering before its time. It reminded me of that sustained organ note on the night Mallory died. A sound held too long, until the music no longer welcomed it. It was Lewis who found it, folded twice, and sitting awkwardly in the waste-paper basket, as though it had been placed there rather than thrown. The paper was thick, the kind kept in a drawer for occasions one does not expect but cannot entirely rule out. The address on the front was simply R, no title, no surname, the sort of initial that assumes its reader will need no more. Lewis handed it to me without comment. The envelope was unsealed. Inside, one sheet, written in the same precise hand I had seen in Mallory's sermons, though with a hesitation at certain turns of phrase, as if he were testing the ground before stepping fully onto it. It began without greeting. Our youthful sin is not less for having grown old with us. A line that made the room's air thicken. The price at last demanded is one we have always known must come, though we hoped the debtor might forget the debt. The rest of the page circled around the idea without naming it, moving between confession and warning, as though Mallory himself had not quite decided which it was to be. There was, midway down, a faint echo of Milton, long is the way and hard, slipped in without quotation marks, as if it were a private code. I could not decide whether the allusion was meant to clarify or to conceal. Lewis, reading over my shoulder, asked if I thought it had to do with the college. I told him I thought it had to do with people, and people, in my experience, are both simpler and infinitely more complicated than institutions. He said nothing further, but I could feel the question waiting between us. I slipped the letter back into its envelope and into my pocket. If it had been meant to reach R, it had failed. If it had been meant to be destroyed, it had failed again. Between those two failures, I suspected, lay the beginnings of our truth. That evening we took ourselves to a small pub off Holywell Street, one of the few that still smelt faintly of pipe smoke in its walls. The air was close, the tables pushed too near one another, the ceiling low enough that the clink of glasses seemed amplified. Lewis ordered a pint and watched the muted television above the bar. I ordered a whiskey and watched the amber catch in the glass like a pause between sentences. Forgiveness. Real forgiveness is rarer than the liturgies suggest. Mallory, if he sought it, must have known that. If he refused it, perhaps he had found some comfort in the refusal. I've always suspected that absolution is more easily offered by those who have little to forgive themselves. The rest of us tend to hold on to our grievances the way a miser holds coins. Not because they are worth much, but because they are all we have left to prove we were wronged. I thought of R. Whoever they were, they had once been close enough to Mallory to share in this youthful sin. A student, a colleague, a friend. The letter did not tremble with romantic longing. It had the weight of something less decorative and more dangerous. The price at last demanded suggested reckoning, not reconciliation. Lewis asked if I thought R might still be in Oxford. I told him that if they were, they would know by now that Mallory was dead, and if they were not, the news would reach them in its own time, as all news eventually does. Either way, the letter in my pocket was a message that had never been spoken aloud. When we left the pub, the rain had begun again, fine and persistent, darkening the stone beneath our feet. The bells from some distant college were sounding the hour, their timing more certain than St. Friedwide's had been that Sunday morning. But even so, one chime seemed to come just a fraction too late, as if reluctant to be part of the rest. The bursar chose the King's Arms, perhaps believing its proximity to the college would lend an air of collegial frankness to our conversation. We sat at a small table by the window, the November light pressing thinly through the glass. His choice of meal was deliberate: cold ham, mustard, a half-pint of bitter, something one could eat without the inconvenience of looking away from one's companion for long. Between bites he mentioned, as though recalling an afterthought, that Mallory had lately been reviewing the bequest records. A routine audit, he said, though he admitted Mallory had been preparing a report marked confidential. The bursar's smile conveyed his belief that confidential was the sort of term academics use to make their work seem more consequential than it was. He suspected some minor accounting error, the sort easily corrected and soon forgotten. I made a show of agreeing, but inwardly the word hung in my mind like a note held just too long, enough to make you listen for its discord. Accounting errors rarely leave sermons unfinished or letters unsent. After lunch I went to find Venn. His rooms smelled faintly of the sweet decay of old claret. The curtains were half drawn, the books arranged in a pattern that might have been either methodical or neglected. He met my questions with a sardonic half-smile, as though the whole business amused him. Mallory, he said, had become irrational, obsessed with what Venn dismissed as ancient gossip. There was, he claimed, no basis for any of it, though he offered nothing by way of detail. I asked where he had been on the night Mallory died. Dining with the Dean, he replied at once, and there was a trace of satisfaction in the speed of it. A fine bottle of 63 port, he added, as if the vintage itself might serve as witness. Lewis, with his dogged habit of verification, later confirmed the dinner had taken place. The Dean himself, however, proved less straightforward. When I visited him in his book-lined study, he admitted to the dinner, but became peculiarly evasive when I asked what time it had ended. He spoke in approximations. Around 10, perhaps a little after, and seemed uncharacteristically eager to steer the conversation towards the recent successes of the rowing team. I've learned that evasiveness is rarely about the fact in question. More often it conceals some other truth one would rather not have disturbed. The Dean's uncertainty about the time might have been nothing at all, or it might have been the shadow of something that could not bear the clarity of a clock face. As I left his rooms, the scent of polished oak and fading tobacco clung in the corridor. Outside, the quad lay in pale sunlight, the air sharp enough to make each footstep sound too loud. I found myself thinking of Mallory, poring over bequest, records in that neat study of his, altering a single word in a line of Herbert, and wondering how close he had come to writing down the thing that would not let him rest. Lewis caught up with me as I crossed towards the street. He had the guest register I'd asked for days ago, signed out at last from the bursar's office. A quick glance showed nothing obviously amiss, names, dates, room numbers, but my eye paused on an entry from midweek. R.K. Ellison. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the signature fluid, almost too elegant. It was the kind of script that took trouble to maintain. I folded the register shut and handed it back to Lewis. We would look more closely later. For now, the sound of St. Fritzwide's bells reached us across the rooftops, their phrasing almost, though not quite, correct. There is comfort in mistakes repeated, but I have never been able to hear. It was late in the afternoon when I unfolded Mallory's sermon again, the paper creasing into familiar lines, the ink catching faintly in the lamplight. I'd read it half a dozen times by now, each pass yielding nothing more than the altered Herbert line, "Thy cause where the poet had written thy laws." Yet something in it still pressed at the edges of my mind. It came, as such things often do, not with a jolt but with the smallest turn of recognition. Herbert had written the poem originally in English, but an early Latin version had been circulated among certain scholars, complete with the peculiarities of translation. The word Mallory used, causa, was not a mistranslation so much as an old one, specific to a handful of editions. In most renderings it became ledgers, the proper laws. Only a very particular scholar, with access to a very particular text, would use causa, and never by accident. I leaned back, closing my eyes, letting the small library room of my flat settle into silence. The air smelled of dust and old whiskey. Somewhere in that silence was a memory, years ago, perhaps in my first months in Oxford, of reading a theological essay in which the same choice had been made. I could see the page, narrow margins, a typeface faint in places, the author's voice confident to the point of presumption, an obscure journal, long out of print. The Bodleian's reading room was nearly empty when I arrived. The porter looked up at me without surprise, as though I had simply returned to a conversation we'd left unfinished years before. I gave him the journal's title, dredged from memory, and was sent down into the cool hush of the lower stacks. It took longer than I expected to find it, the thin spine hidden between larger, more self-important volumes. The essay was there, as I'd recalled, the Latin Herbert line rendered with that same stubborn causa. The title was nothing remarkable, on the primacy of conscience in doctrinal dispute, but it was the author's name that held me, one of the three young men in Mallory's photograph smiling into some summer-long. Past, I read the essay again, slowly this time. It was less the content than the tone that struck me, the certainty of youth, the delight in being just contrary enough to unsettle the established order. Here was the hand that had shaped Mallory's altered line, not in the sense of authorship, but of influence, the kind that leaves its mark long after friendship has frayed or failed. Climbing back into the light of the upper reading room, I thought of that photograph on Mallory's mantelpiece. Three men, now scattered across whatever lives they had built, bound still by the invisible thread of something shared, and perhaps, in time, regretted. The sermon draft in my pocket felt heavier than paper should. On the way out, I passed under the Radcliffe camera's dome, the rain beginning again in fine, deliberate strokes. I imagined Mallory at his desk, reaching for Herbert in Latin, choosing causa over ledgers, knowing the choice would mean nothing to most and far too much to a few. Back in the street, the bells were ringing again, their intervals clean this time, as if some unseen hand had corrected the rhythm. Yet I found myself listening for the hesitation, the faint falter that so often told me more than perfection ever could, then without wondering if they are mistakes at all. I arrived at the chapel in the last hour of daylight, the stone walls holding the chill in a way that seemed to sharpen the music. The choir were gathered loosely at the front, their voices testing the air before settling into rehearsal. I stayed near the back, letting the shadows have me, my coat collar turned up against a draught that seemed to come from nowhere in particular. Charlotte was standing slightly apart, her posture easy but her gaze fixed on the music in front of her. The first notes of Handel's aria rose with an unforced precision, as if the sound had always been in the air, and she was merely uncovering it. I have no gift for singing, but I know when a voice has the rare quality of sounding both certain and private, as though it is telling you something meant only for you. Between verses she lowered the score just enough to look my way. In the stillness before the organ began again, her voice carried to me without effort. She said she and Mallory had argued, about what, she did not say, 1 week before his death. His warning to her had been curiously phrased, that she should not repeat the mistakes of others. The words hung in the space between us, neither an accusation nor a comfort. I asked what he meant. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, the refusal more final than if she had spoken it aloud. The organist resumed, and she turned back to the aria, her voice now shaded by something the music could not conceal. I moved closer, under pretence of examining the chapel's carvings, and let my eyes fall to her open score. In the upper corner, in faint pencil, was a dedication, to C.E., in hope of absolution. The initials beneath were R.M. The letters were written with the slant of a hand accustomed to carefulness, the sort of script that belongs more to a diary than to public correspondence. I stepped back before she could notice where my attention had strayed. The rehearsal continued, though my listening had shifted. Each phrase seemed to echo the private sentence I had just read. The rest of the choir were intent on the conductor's small gestures, none of them aware, or pretending not to be, that something else was happening in the margins. When the final note faded, the singers began to scatter, their voices dropping into ordinary registers. Charlotte gathered her music and slipped it into a leather case. I considered asking her about the dedication, but the certainty that she would deflect the question kept me silent. She passed me at the door, her expression neutral, her scent briefly mingling with the damp of the chapel air. Lewis was waiting outside in the quad, stamping the cold from his feet. He asked if I'd learned anything useful. I told him only that I had heard a fine aria. The truth would keep a little longer. As we walked away, I thought again of her words, that Mallory had warned her against repeating the mistakes of others. It was a phrase heavy with implication, one that suggested a chain of events still unfinished. The dedication in her score, in hope of absolution, seemed to me not the plea of the guilty, but the offering of someone who had been complicit in another's wrong, and was now waiting to see whether history would in fact repeat itself. The evening light had thinned to the colour of parchment, the first lamps in the college windows casting small rectangles onto the wet cobbles. Somewhere behind us, the organist had begun again, this time alone, the notes rising with a hesitance that felt almost human. It occurred to me that music, like confession, can be offered freely, but it is never entirely in the giver's control what the listener will hear. By late afternoon, the rain had set in over Oxford, turning the flagstones in the quad into slick mirrors. Morse sat in the common room of St. Anselm's, his pint of bitter cradled between his hands, explaining his latest theory to a patient but sceptical Lewis. "It fits, you see," Morse said, leaning forward. "Mallory, respected, upright, but carrying the burden of a youthful indiscretion, then discovers it, uses it, blackmail, plain and simple. Mallory, realizing his reputation and perhaps his faith would not survive the exposure, decides to end it. Lewis, ever the careful listener, tapped the rim of his teacup. And the letter to R. "A farewell," Morse replied, coded enough to hint at the sin, but vague enough to avoid implicating anyone outright. The altered quotation in the sermon, a subtle cry for help, if you like. Lewis frowned. "And the argument with Charlotte Ayres?" Morse dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "Collateral. Mallory was concerned. She might make similar mistakes, perhaps in a professional or romantic context. Not central to the matter." They were interrupted by the bursar, passing through on his way to high table, who paused to offer his condolences for the distressing business. Morse managed a polite nod before resuming his account, but his earlier enthusiasm had already begun to ebb. The rest of the evening was a slow trudge through procedural calls, notes, and cross-checks. By the time Morse returned to his flat, the rain had stopped, leaving the city in a damp, gleaming hush. He poured himself a whiskey, sat at his desk, and unfolded the photocopy of Mallory's unfinished sermon. He had read it at least a dozen times, but now, in the quiet, something tugged at him. Not the altered word, he had made peace with that as a deliberate reference, but the punctuation. A comma, small, precise, and placed where no stylist, no editor, no George Herbert would ever have put it. He read the line aloud. "Truth never grows old." That pause, unnatural, deliberate, broke the rhythm entirely. He tried moving it mentally, then removing it altogether, but the version Mallory had written refused to fade from his mind. Morse leaned back, eyes narrowing. A comma like that was not an accident, it was a signal. To whom, and about what, was another question entirely. He poured another measure of whiskey and stared at the photocopy as though it might confess. His earlier theory, neat, plausible, and pleasingly tragic, began to feel like a lecture prepared for the wrong audience. By midnight, the edges of his certainty had worn away. The truth, Morse knew, was still out there. But like the rain pooling in the gutters of Oxford's streets, it was waiting for the right moment to run free. The comma was too precise. Morse had stared at the altered sermon for hours, rolling the words on his tongue until the cadence felt deliberate. Truth never grows old. A pause where none belonged, splitting the thought like a knife. The emphasis shifted, turning the phrase into a signpost rather than a statement. He retrieved Mallory's diary from the evidence bag Lewis had left on his desk, flipping through its cream pages, the faint scent of pipe smoke still clinging to them. One date stood out, 3 days before the vicar's death, its final line trailing off mid-sentence, then the gap, a clean, surgical tear, as if made by someone with the time and presence of mind to avoid ragged edges. The entry before the missing page caught his eye. Meeting at the place where Herbert's truth meets Milton's fall. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. Herbert, truth, Milton, fall. George Herbert's The Temple held the line Mallory had used in his sermon. Milton's fall was obvious enough. Paradise lost. And where did those meet? His mind wandered through the college cloisters, recalling the carved lintels, the rain-polished statues, the stone inscriptions students hurried past without noticing. Then he remembered, in St. Athanasius Cloister, a peculiar carving above the east arcade, Herbert's words inscribed in Latin, just above a weathered relief of Lucifer's expulsion. The two texts literally met in stone, a place that, in Mallory's mind, might conceal a truth of its own. By the time he crossed the quad, dusk had pooled in the cloister, turning the stone a bruised grey. A faint echo of footsteps followed him, but when he glanced over his shoulder, the arches framed only empty air. The carving was smaller than he remembered, half hidden by the ivy the gardeners never seemed to touch. Running his fingers over the stone, he found the edges looser than they should be. Years of weather had worked the frame free. A gentle tug, and the plaque came away with a gritty sigh. Behind it, folded twice over, was a sheet of cream paper, thicker than the diary leaves, but unmistakably from the same binding. Morse eased it open, the creases splitting slightly under his fingers. The handwriting was steady, almost calm. If you are reading this, then my choice has been taken from me. I write to set the record straight, though God alone can judge me. 40 years ago, in the first term of my curacy, I met her. She was the most brilliant singer I had known, and I, foolish, arrogant, certain I could manage sin as though it were a footnote, loved her. She bore me a son. I failed them both. For the sake of my career, my collar, my cowardice, I let them vanish into silence. And now that son has returned, unknowingly into my care. He signs his letters R.M., the same as mine. I have lived a lie before him, and it has been my greatest punishment. Morse read it twice, then a third time, the words blurring under the dim cloister light. R.M., not an adversary, but blood. Not blackmail, but guilt so old it had calcified into a kind of penance. And Charlotte Ayres, her careful avoidance of certain names, began to make an uneasy kind of sense. He slid the page into his pocket, replacing the carving with the same careful touch Mallory must have used when hiding it. As he stepped back, the bells of the college tolled the quarter hour, their sound hollow against the night. Lewis was waiting at the gate, hands deep in his coat pockets. "Anything?" Morse lit a cigarette, exhaling into the damp air. Only that the dead are rarely as simple as the living would like them to be. They walked back through the quad in silence, the ivy shivering against the cloister wall. Somewhere above them, a choir's rehearsal drifted faintly into the night, a fragment of harmony that faded before Morse could catch the final note. The fire in Morse's flat had burned low when he finished reading the last page of Mallory's diary. Outside, Cowley Road's late traffic murmured like a restless tide. He closed the book slowly, almost with reverence, as though the dead man might feel the weight of his palm. R.M. Richard Mallory. The name had been there all along, but camouflaged beneath an unspoken grief. The young lecturer's delicate courtesy, the awkward distance he had kept from the funeral. These were not the signs of a mere colleague, but of a son who could not claim his mourning in public. Lewis arrived just after 8 the next morning, coat collar turned up against the drizzle. "You look as if you've been up all night, sir." "I have," Morse replied, reaching for his overcoat. "We're going to the bursar." The bursar's office was a narrow, book-lined cell smelling faintly of lavender polish. She received them with the air of a hostess welcoming unwelcome guests. Morse wasted no time. "I know why Mallory was going through the bequest records," he said. "The college's benefaction from 1972, the change in the will that cut out the unnamed heir. That heir was Richard Mallory. His son." The bursar's eyes were still, but something brittle passed through her voice. "You have no proof." Morse laid the diary on the desk, open at the last page. "I have his own words, and I have a question. When you served the port after high table last Thursday, were you aware it would be Mallory's last glass?" For the briefest moment, she closed her eyes, as though hearing a discordant chord in an otherwise perfect fugue. "He was going to destroy the college," she said quietly. 40 years of service, the traditions, the dignity, all for the sake of one boy's claim. "One boy's truth," Morse corrected, his voice low. Her hands were steady as she reached for the diary, but she did not touch it. "You can't imagine what scandal does here, how it seeps into every corridor. It was not malice, Inspector. It was protection." "Protection," Morse repeated, tasting the word as though it were a weak wine. "You poisoned him." She did not answer, but the silence was confirmation enough. In the quad, rain traced dark veins through the honeyed stone. Lewis fell into step beside him. "Do we charge her?" "Yes," Morse said. Then after a pause, "But it won't mend anything." That Sunday, Morse attended morning service in the college chapel. The choir's voices rose, pure and intricate, the Handel aria returning like a half-forgotten memory. Charlotte sang as though for no one but herself. The sermon, Mallory's last, was delivered by the dean in a voice that lacked conviction. It was in the final lines, the lines about truth, that Morse finally understood the meaning of the misplaced comma. It altered the rhythm of the sentence, giving breath where none should be, a moment's pause before the word forgive. Mallory had left it there deliberately, a subtle invitation to consider that forgiveness, however late, was still possible. After the service, Morse lingered in the cloister where Herbert's angel and Milton's serpent faced each other in stone. The drizzle had stopped, the air was faintly warm. He thought of Mallory, of Richard, of the son who would never truly know his father except through a few careful words in a diary. As the bells began to toll, Morse felt for his cigarette case, then thought better of it. Instead, he stood listening until the final note faded, leaving only the quiet hum of the city beyond the walls. Some truths, he thought, did not so much set one free as leave one standing in a larger kind of prison, the kind built from memory. The bursar did not look up at first when Lewis and Morse stepped into her office. The room smelled faintly of old vellum and lavender polish, the air heavy with the dust of unhandled books. Afternoon light spilled in pale strips across the carpet, illuminating the neat fortress of ledgers stacked on her desk. She was writing, with the kind of calm precision Morse associated with those who have already decided their fate. Lewis cleared his throat. "Mrs. Holloway?" She set down her pen, capped it with care, and folded her hands in her lap. Her eyes, a sharp grey, fixed on Lewis with a composure that was almost unnerving. "You've come for me, then?" Lewis shifted his weight. "I'm afraid we'll need you to come down to the station, ma'am, regarding the death of Reverend Mallory." For a moment there was silence. Then she gave a single, small nod, as though the formality of the charge were merely an item to be ticked off her agenda. "I did what was necessary," she said, her voice even, "for the good of the college." Morse, leaning against the doorframe, tilted his head. "Necessary? You poisoned a man to protect an account ledger." Her mouth twitched, the faintest ghost of a smile. "You think so little of what we guard here, Inspector. It was not a ledger. It was a covenant, a promise stretching back centuries. Mallory wanted to tear it open and let scandal eat away at it like moths in the vestry cupboard." Lewis spoke gently. "He was his son." She turned her gaze to the window. And yet, it would have been better for all concerned if that particular truth had remained unspoken. Morse said nothing. He had heard this tone before, the unshakable certainty of those who believe history justifies the present. He knew there was no point in arguing. The moral calculus had been done long before Mallory's final glass of wine. Lewis stepped forward. "Ma'am, if you'll come with me." She rose without protest, smoothing the front of her skirt, and allowed him to guide her toward the door. Her steps were measured, deliberate, like someone walking out of chapel after Compline. As they passed Morse, she paused. "I suppose you'll write your report," she said. "I suppose I will," Morse replied. They left together, their footsteps fading down the corridor. Morse remained in the office for a moment longer. A pot of chrysanthemums stood on the windowsill, their petals beginning to brown at the edges. The ledgers still lay in their precise stacks, mute guardians of secrets that would now, inevitably, be pried open. When Morse finally emerged into the quad, the late afternoon was sliding toward evening. The sky was a pale wash of silver, and the first notes of the bell drifted from the chapel tower, calling the faithful, or at least the dutiful, to evensong. The phrasing was still slightly off, as it had been since Mallory's death. Perhaps the new bell ringer lacked his touch, or perhaps Morse was imagining it. Either way, it jarred against the otherwise immaculate order of the place. Across the lawn, Charlotte was walking with a colleague. She looked up as Morse appeared, but her gaze passed over him as if he were no more than another figure among the shadows of the cloisters. When Lewis had told her of the bursar's confession, she had turned away without speaking. Morse had not tried again. Some truths, once uncovered, left only silence in their wake. He buttoned his coat and headed for the gate. The bells tolled on behind him, slightly hesitant, like a choir boy stumbling on a familiar verse, and Morse felt that for once he had no desire to correct the error. The imperfections of Oxford were perhaps what kept it alive. His room was dim but for the yellow pool of light from the desk lamp. A record spun slowly on the turntable, the opening strains of "Comfort Ye," my people rising like a whispered benediction. Morse poured himself a glass of Chablis, the cork rolling lazily to a halt against the leg of the chair. He had laid the pages of Herbert before him, the poem in its original form, the one Mallory had knowingly altered. The correction, so small it could be mistaken for a printer's slip, seemed now like the hinge on which the whole matter had turned. The word sat there, perfectly chosen, untouched by the clumsy substitution that had so nettled him in Mallory's draft. On another day, perhaps, he might have written to the Bodleian to note the error in the old essay, or chased down the theological implications of such a choice. Tonight, he let it lie. Mallory was gone. The bursar would be gone soon enough. Richard Mallory's life would move in a new, diminished orbit, while Charlotte would sing her handle to another audience, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond the choir stalls. He tried to imagine the sermon as Mallory might have intended it, restored and whole. Would it have been one of those rare addresses that left the congregation in thoughtful silence, or merely another Sunday homily, politely received, politely forgotten? More to the point, would it have granted absolution to anyone? To Richard, to Charlotte, to the man who had written it, to himself? The question lingered like the unresolved cadence of the aria now threading through the room. Morse tilted the glass and studied the pale wine, the way it caught the light. It was too easy, he thought, to mistake the absence of condemnation for forgiveness. Oxford was good at that. Centuries of smoothing over awkward truths, of letting the rain wash the pavements clean while the stones remembered everything. The handle moved on, violins lifting the air, then falling into that gentle repetition he liked so much. Outside, the rain had thickened, tapping against the sash window in an irregular rhythm, as if some careless hand were drumming on the glass. Morse stood, crossed to the window, and watched the blurred lights in the street lamps below. Figures moved under umbrellas, their steps brisk, purposeful, each carrying their own untold errand through the wet night. Behind him, the record turned, the grooves tracing their spiral path towards silence. He drained the glass and set it down, the Chablis leaving a faint ring on the desk beside Herbert's verses. He closed the book, shutting the poem away. In Oxford, truth was always half a sentence short.